All right, back to taxes, and forgive me, we're going to try this again. Back in 2020, the New York Times got a bunch of Donald Trump's tax returns going back 2 decades. Donald Trump's showed that he barely paid taxes in both the years that he was elected and then sworn in as president. That the billionaire only paid $750 in federal taxes in 2016 and 2017. Less than a firefighter, again, less than a school teacher, again, less than you. What's more, before that, he didn't pay any income taxes for 10 of the previous 15 years. At the time, Donald Trump's organization's lawyer said that some of the facts, if not all, most of the facts, if not all, appear to be inaccurate. 6 years later, when Donald Trump was president again last year, he sued this year, actually, he sued the IRS for $10 billion. This happened earlier this year. A little more, by the way, than 2/3 of the agency's budget. A lot of money. It created a conflict because the president was now suing a government that he oversaw, putting him on both sides of the argument. Again, it's like demanding money from your reflection in the mirror. A judge overseeing the case signaled that position on both sides was untenable. She put a deadline on briefs from Trump's team and from the government, which she feared would be basically the same thing, and signaled that she might drop the case. Just before she would be able to do that, Donald Trump himself dropped it and settled with the DOJ. This was a news that we reported on yesterday. Democrats in Congress got this news as Todd Blanche, the deputy attorney general who made this decision, was sitting in front of them for an appropriations hearing, and they grilled him on it. They said, "You're the president's personal attorney. What are you doing creating what many are calling, they are calling, others are calling, a slush fund to pay off Donald Trump's allies, potentially?" He denied all that. But what these senators were not able to get to was something the DOJ had not at that time been forthcoming about. It was a little insert that was discovered later in the day, included via hyperlink in the announcement about this settlement. And that link brought you to a 3-paragraph addendum. It was about Donald Trump, his family, and his business getting immunity from tax audits, both in the past, in the present, and the future. It said the United States releases, waives, acquits, and forever discharges each of the plaintiffs and is hereby forever barred and precluded from any prosecuting or pursuing any and all claims, counterclaims, causes of action, appeals, or requests for any relief, etc. And again, that appears to say that Donald Trump is immune from tax audits. And the Times reports it could be saving Donald Trump more than $100 million, which is money from his money-losing Chicago skyscraper. All right, joining us once again to talk about this, New York Times investigative reporter Russ Buettner, who has written extensively about Donald Trump's finances, MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin, and MS Now legal analyst and former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, Barbara McQuade. A lot there, but I think it's important to just lay it out and remind everybody how we got to this point and why Donald Trump was upset. Those taxes, when you guys first reported on them, were shocking. And there was clearly some fear within Trump and his team that revealing that he paid no taxes or very little taxes could be very politically damaging. They were not as politically damaging as people would have thought. Then he sued, and now it appears he doesn't think anything's going to be damaging.
Yeah, it's quite a remarkable turn of events. I mean, that original story we did based on his taxes include a long section on this mysterious audit that he'd been talking about for years. And that part of it pertained to a refund that he got in about 2010, 2011, where he claimed pent-up losses on his casinos and also on his Chicago tower that entitled him to get a refund on every dime he had paid in income taxes from 2005 to 2007. That was an extraordinary period in his life because he typically paid almost no income taxes. Those years were the first years of The Apprentice. He had huge windfalls, $30, $40 million a year from the show and also from a wave of new licensing and endorsement deals. He got all that money back, $73 million with the interest that was built into it. And the IRS, their typical practice is to allow the refund and then to start an audit of whether it works. They started that audit in about 2011. It had not been finished by the time we got his tax returns. There was reference to it again in a congressional report in 2022. We spoke to Eric Trump in 2024 about the Chicago Tower audit. He acknowledged that the audit was still ongoing and had been for years. I believe it's still ongoing to this day, and I believe the total is actually far greater than $100 million.
So what's interesting about, I mean, there's many interesting things about this, but what caught my attention yesterday was we heard from Todd Blanche and J.D. Vance. Everybody's saying that this settlement is not going to pay out Donald Trump. It won't benefit Donald Trump or his family in any way. This is about people who have been politically persecuted. Then later on, when you see this addendum, this 3 paragraphs, which I think are just signed by Todd Blanche, I think that's correct. It shows you a way in which they are potentially getting quite a big payout, that you're barring the IRS from ever auditing Donald Trump, going back to the past and into the future.
I'm so glad you said that about the future, because I want to clarify one small thing, because the fine print matters, even with respect to a settlement that looks to be unlawful in any number of ways. Yes, it prohibits future audits, but only as to tax liability that he would have had as of May 18th, 2026. So if tomorrow Donald Trump commits the tax fraud of the century, then theoretically future departments of justice and the IRS and the Treasury can go after him.
But up until yesterday, he could do it.
Absolutely. And you're right to say that that's almost like the tax equivalent of an in-kind contribution, right? He is getting hundreds of millions of dollars potentially in value from this settlement, even though he will not allegedly take part in the anti-weaponization fund. He says he will not be a claimant to that. The settlement agreement bars him from being a claimant to that. So on one hand, he's not getting cash. On the other hand, he's certainly getting a reward.
The immunity decision by the Supreme Court gave Donald Trump immunity for any interactions that he has with his attorney general, right? Were there caveats to that?
Any interactions with his attorney general, what it said was, I think it's a little bit more narrow than that. It was talking in the context of getting advice from people at the Department of Justice vis-a-vis the 2020 election. It said that conversations that he had with people in the Department of Justice at that time could be considered official acts and therefore were covered by immunity for his official acts. But of course, in the wake of that decision, we never had further litigation that sorted out what was official and what was unofficial. And certainly Jack Smith and his lawyers were saying that a bulk of actions that the president took that were under indictment were in fact unofficial acts. One could say the same about this, that ultra vires or patently unlawful acts that violate an existing federal law are themselves could never be official. And Katie, I want to point out to you and the viewers, there's a federal statute that prohibits certain people in the federal government from influencing an audit, either the conduct of an audit or stopping an audit. One of the people that is specifically enumerated in that statute is the President of the United States. If Congress viewed the president as immune from prosecution, it would have never named the president in that statute as someone who couldn't commit that act, because what is the way in which that statute's enforced? It's enforced by a criminal prosecution by that very same Department of Justice.
But Barbara, this is all so tangled and hard to follow. And when you talk about the Supreme Court and the way they've ruled against the president, I guess I bring it up for the reason that they just have, there's been a knee-jerk reaction to allow a president or an executive to do whatever they want almost while they're in office. And when you're starting to define or trying to define what is an official act and what is not an official act, I wonder, is this the sort of thing that would be clear-cut? Am I wrong to even bring this into the conversation?
No, I think you're absolutely right, because I think there is a very good argument that it's not an official act. Donald Trump he filed this lawsuit in his personal capacity, as did his sons and his company. And so I think that you could say that that is outside the scope of his official acts. The reason this case is so problematic from the start is that it is quite highly doubtful that this court ever had jurisdiction for this case to be filed in the first place. And as you pointed out earlier, today was the day when the parties were supposed to justify the case as a genuine case or controversy. And so if there is no case or controversy, that means there can be no settlement of an illegitimate claim. And so creating this bucket of money to pay out to political cronies is therefore outside the scope of not only a legitimate legal case, but outside the scope of the presidential's official duties. I think it's also noteworthy that the president has this constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And so to the extent he is directing his Justice Department to engage in this activity, I think one could argue that he is outside the scope of his legitimate authority there as well. Now, the one question will be, who has standing as a plaintiff to challenge this? We saw a case brought today by Harry Dunn, who was one of the police officers who was beaten on January 6th. I don't think he's going to have standing in this case. But you know who would? James Comey. I'd love to see him file a claim seeking
Why would he have standing?
For the weaponization, be denied, and then file a lawsuit challenging the establishment of this fund, because I think that could tee it up for Supreme Court review.
Well, let me ask you this. If he's able to challenge the fund, is he also able to challenge the tax audit?
I don't know that he's able to challenge the tax audit. I suppose one could argue that that is all part and parcel of the same settlement agreement. And so to the extent it is, and I guess it is, right, it was an addendum to the agreement, then I would say yes. I mean, the problem with each of the steps in this case is, first, no legitimate case or controversy that gives the court jurisdiction under the Constitution. Therefore, two, you can't have a settlement of a case that never was legitimate in the first place. In addition, settlements are supposed to be resolutions that relate to the subject matter of the statute, the particular federal statute involved. Here, these were violations of the Privacy Act and the Internal Revenue Act. It seems that when Todd Blanche says this is all about general weaponization, there is not going to be a way to directly tie it to those two statutes. So that's a problem as well. And then finally, this audit release is in no way related to the original alleged wrong of the leak of the tax return information. So there are about three different ways this house of cards can tumble. And I think somebody who applies for relief and is denied would be in position to challenge the whole thing.